The verdict took 6 hours. 6 hours of pacing, 6 hours of memories replaying in my head. Mark as a child, Mark as a teenager, Mark as a man I no longer recognized. When the jury returned, I held my breath. On the charge of conspiracy to commit homicide, the foreman said, we find the defendant guilty. Mark collapsed back into his chair. On charges of grand theft, fraud, forgery, and attempted flight, guilty on all counts. The judge didn't hesitate. Mr. Harrison, you have demonstrated a calculated disregard for human life, specifically your mother's. This court sentences you to 25 years in state prison. 25 years. Mark screamed. This is your fault, he shouted at me as officers restrained him. You ruined me. I stood. No, Mark, I said calmly. You did that yourself. Rachel was sentenced later, 7 years. As they were taken away, the house felt emptier than it ever had. Not quieter, emptier. Weeks passed. Letters came from Mark, begging, apologizing, blaming. I read none of them. Instead, I rewrote my future. The stolen money was recovered, properties restored, offshore accounts frozen. I created a trust for my grandchildren, education, healthcare, stability. And then I did something unexpected. I founded a rehabilitation program for gambling addiction. Not for Mark, for people who still had a chance, people who hadn't crossed the line he had. Some called it mercy. It wasn't. It was purpose. I had won the case, but the hardest part was still ahead, learning how to live after burying a child who was still alive. 5 years have passed. I'm still here, stronger than the doctors ever predicted. My grandchildren visit me every weekend. They ask questions I answer carefully, truthfully, but gently. Why is Daddy in prison? Because he made choices that hurt people. Will he come back? Someday, but that doesn't change who loves you now. The foundation has helped thousands, families saved from debt, marriages repaired, lives redirected before greed turned fatal. One afternoon, a young man stood before me after a session. I almost did what your son did, he said quietly, but your story stopped me. That was my legacy. Not buildings, not money, but prevention. Last month, another letter arrived from prison. Mark wrote about therapy, about regret, about understanding too late. I folded the letter. I did not burn it. I did not answer it. Some wounds don't need reopening to heal. I sit on my balcony now, watching the sunset, thinking of what nearly ended and what didn't. I was supposed to die quietly. Instead, I lived loudly. I exposed betrayal. I chose justice. And I turned a planned ending into a beginning. They waited for my death to claim my fortune, but my survival became their sentence. The courtroom felt colder than the hospital ever had. Mark sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, hands cuffed, shoulders hunched like the weight of reality had finally bent him. He didn't look like my son anymore. He looked like a stranger wearing his face. Rachel sat 2 rows behind him, avoiding eye contact. Her deal with the prosecution had already been signed. She would testify against him in exchange for a lighter sentence. When the judge entered, the room rose. Cameras clicked quietly. Reporters leaned forward. This wasn't just a trial. It was a public autopsy of a family. The prosecutor began calmly, methodically. This case is not about money alone. It is about betrayal at the deepest level. A son who didn't just wait for his mother to die, but tried to make it happen faster. Mark's lawyer objected repeatedly, but the evidence was overwhelming. First came the financial expert. They projected bank records onto a large screen, transfers, withdrawals, forged signatures. Over the last 3 years, the expert testified, the defendant illegally transferred approximately $1.2 million from his mother's accounts. Much of it went to casinos, offshore accounts, and luxury purchases. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Then came the hospital orderly, Frank. His voice shook as he spoke. He told me she was suffering. He said no one would question it because she was already dying. He offered me $50,000. The prosecutor asked, "Did the defendant give you money?" "Yes, $10,000 up front." The bank transfer appeared on the screen. Mark stared at the table. Then it was Rachel's turn. She cried, trembled, claimed fear, claimed manipulation, but the recordings destroyed her story. The jury heard her laughter, her excitement, her voice saying, "I don't want to wait for her to die naturally." Finally, it was my turn. I walked to the stand slowly, but I did not shake. The prosecutor asked gently, "Mrs. Helen, how did you feel when your son was told you had days to live?" I swallowed. "He smiled," I said, "not from shock, from relief." The room went silent. I gave that man my entire life, and the moment he thought it was ending, he saw freedom, not loss. Mark finally looked up at me. Our eyes met. For a brief moment, I saw fear replace arrogance, and I knew no matter the verdict, he had already lost. The jury had heard the truth. Now the only question left was how heavy justice would fall. That night, alone with the hum of machines, I made a decision. If my son wanted a dying mother, I would give him one, just not the ending he expected. The next morning, Mark and Rachel arrived carrying a folder thick with papers and fake concern. "Mom," Mark said softly, "these are just formalities, insurance stuff, authorizations." I peeked through half-closed eyes. Property transfers, power of attorney, bank access. I let my hand shake as I pushed the pen away. "Tomorrow," I whispered. "I'm too weak today." Frustration flashed across Mark's face, just for a second. Rachel lingered behind, watching me the way hunters watch injured prey. After they left, a nurse named Brenda leaned close. "Miss Helen, I overheard them in the hallway. They were talking about ending things early." My blood ran cold. That night, when I returned home under terminal care, I knew I was surrounded by enemies inside my own walls. And then, by accident or fate, I heard everything. Mark and Rachel discussed appraisers, buyers, even someone at the hospital who could speed things up. Murder. I contacted a lawyer, installed cameras, collected proof. Every smile they wore became evidence. Every celebration brought them closer to ruin. They thought I was fading fast, but every word they spoke was sealing their fate. The cameras worked perfectly. I watched them toast my death with champagne, joke about my funeral, plan vacations with money stolen from my accounts. Worse, I learned the truth. Mark was drowning in gambling debt, nearly $1 million. That explained everything. My lawyer uncovered years of theft, forged signatures, offshore accounts, and then proof of a hired hospital worker. Attempted murder. I signed a new will in secret. Mark would receive almost nothing. They, however, believed they'd won, and that belief made them careless. They were celebrating too early, and tomorrow they would celebrate in front of everyone. I asked for a final family gathering. Mark agreed eagerly. When everyone arrived, lawyers, witnesses, police, I stood up, alive, strong, watching their faces collapse. The recordings played, every lie, every plan, every laugh about my death. Mark screamed, Rachel cried, handcuffs clicked. Justice had arrived, but the story wasn't over yet. Mark was sentenced, Rachel testified against him. My money was recovered, my legacy rewritten. I created a foundation for addiction recovery, an education trust for my grandchildren. I survived, not because I was lucky, but because I refused to die quietly. They thought my death would make them rich. Instead, it made me unstoppable. When the doctor stepped into my hospital room, I knew before he spoke. There's a silence doctors carry when they are about to shatter a life. He held his clipboard tightly, as if it could anchor him to the floor. "Helen," he said gently, "the injuries from your accident are far more complicated than we first believed. Your organs are under extreme stress. We're doing everything possible, but realistically, you may only have a few days." A few days. The words landed heavier than the crash that put me here. 3 decades of work, sacrifice, motherhood, and survival reduced to a countdown. I felt my chest tighten, not from pain, but from disbelief. Instinctively, I turned to my son. Mark stood beside the bed, hands folded, face carefully neutral. I searched his eyes for panic, for grief, for even a crack of fear. I wanted him to say something, anything that sounded like love. Behind him, Rachel, my daughter-in-law, pressed her palms over her face and let out exaggerated sobs, loud, theatrical, too perfect. And then I saw it. Through the gaps between her fingers, her eyes were dry, not red, not trembling. They sparkled, not with sadness, but with something dangerously close to relief. The doctor excused himself, closing the door softly. That's when Mark leaned toward me. His voice dropped low, confident, almost victorious. "So, it's finally happening. Everything you built, it'll all be mine and Rachel's now." I felt something crack inside me. Rachel lowered her hands and stepped closer, her grief gone like it had never existed. "5 million in assets," she said casually. "The properties, the stocks, the penthouse. We won't have to pretend anymore." Pretend. They stood there, my own blood and the woman I welcomed into my family, talking about my life as if it were a clearance sale. For 35 years, I had been Mark's mother. I raised him alone after his father died when he was 5. I worked endless hours, cleaned offices at night, signed deals while exhausted, built a real estate empire from nothing, everything so my son would never struggle. And this was my reward? Rachel laughed softly. "When can we start the paperwork?" Mark shrugged. "The lawyer said we could move fast. She probably won't even make it to the weekend." I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe evenly. I couldn't let them see what they'd done to me, not yet. "Do you think she'll suffer?" Rachel asked. Mark shrugged again. "Doctor said she might slip into a coma, hopefully soon. I hate hospitals." They talked about vacations, cruises, which furniture they'd keep, which properties they'd sell. They spoke as if I was already gone. When they finally left, the room felt colder than before. Tears slid silently down my face, but beneath the heartbreak, something else ignited. Anger. Not loud, not wild, focused. An hour later, the doctor returned. This time, he locked the door. "Helen," he said quietly, pulling up a chair, You're not dying in 3 days." I stared at him. "Your condition is serious, but not terminal. I exaggerated because I needed to see how your son would react." My heart raced. "I heard everything they said," he admitted, "and I was right to worry." Hope flickered, dangerous, powerful. "You have time, enough time to protect yourself." As he spoke, one thought echoed louder than anything else. They thought I was already dead, and that mistake would cost them everything. They believed my life was ending. What they didn't know was that the real countdown had just begun, and it wasn't for me.